The runways are cracking. Not slowly, not over decades, but visibly, measurably, every single year. Cracks spiderweb across the tarmac at Pituffik Space Base, the northernmost American military installation on Earth, where radar arrays scan the skies for incoming missiles and where Strategic Command maintains a footprint 700 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The engineers who maintain this base do not speak publicly about what they see, but the reports exist. Classified documents circulated within the Pentagon describe foundations settling, structural deformation, permafrost collapse. The frozen ground that held this base together for 70 years is thawing. The very Earth is betraying its architects, and beneath that collapsing permafrost lies something far more dangerous than melting ice. It lies 150 miles inland from Pituffik, buried under 70 meters of glacial snow, entombed in what was supposed to be perpetual winter, Camp Century, an entire city carved into the ice sheet in 1959. 200 soldiers, a nuclear reactor, tunnels extending half a mile in each direction, and when the army abandoned it in 1967, they left everything behind. 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, tons of PCBs, radioactive waste from the reactor core, 24 million liters of raw sewage frozen in place. The engineers who built Camp Century believed the ice would bury their secrets forever. They were wrong. Climate models now predict that by 2090, the ice covering Camp Century will begin to melt faster than snow accumulates. The countdown has already begun. This is not a story about climate change. This is a story about what climate change is uncovering. A story about bets made in secret war rooms during the Cold War that are now coming due. A story about why Greenland, a frozen island most Americans could not locate on a map, has become the single most contested piece of real estate on the planet. Why presidents from Truman to Trump have tried to buy it. Why Russia and China are circling it. Why the Pentagon considers it indispensable. And why the ice that kept all of this hidden for 80 years is now exposing a calculation so ruthless, so pragmatic, that its architects buried the evidence in tunnels beneath a glacier and prayed no one would ever have to answer for it. The danger is not theoretical. The danger is geological, political, environmental, and immediate. And the people who live on Greenland, 57,000 Inuit who never asked to be at the center of a superpower competition, are about to discover that when your homeland sits on top of the shortest route between nuclear powers, when your ice sheet conceals both rare earth minerals and toxic military waste, when your fjords provide the only naval choke points controlling access to the Atlantic, you do not get to decide your own future. The powers who need you will decide it for you. Let's go back to the moment when this all began. Not to some distant Viking settlement or colonial outpost. To a specific afternoon in November of 1950, when a board of Air Force officers, led by General Gordon Saville, submitted a classified recommendation to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The recommendation was simple. Build an airbase at Thule, Greenland. Make it massive. Make it permanent. Make it operational by 1953. The reasoning was not complicated. If Soviet bombers ever launched a nuclear strike against the United States, they would not cross the Atlantic or Pacific. They would fly over the North Pole. It was the shortest route. The most direct line between Moscow and New York passed directly over Greenland. And if you controlled Greenland, you controlled the highway of the apocalypse. President Truman approved the recommendation in January 1951. 4 months later, a new treaty with Denmark formalized what had been an informal wartime arrangement. The United States would be permitted to construct military installations across Greenland under the NATO defense framework. The Danes agreed. They had little choice. Denmark was a small nation emerging from Nazi occupation with a military incapable of defending an island 3 times the size of Texas. But what Denmark did not know was that the United States had tried to buy Greenland outright 5 years earlier. In 1946, Secretary of State James Burns made a secret offer to the Danish government, $100 million in gold bars, in exchange for full sovereignty over Greenland. Denmark declined. The offer remained classified for 45 years. The construction of Thule Air Base began in July 1951 under the codename Operation Blue Jay. It was the largest peacetime construction project in American military history, comparable, the Army said, to building the Panama Canal. An armada of 120 ships arrived in North Star Bay carrying 12,000 workers and 300,000 tons of equipment. They worked around the clock in temperatures that dropped to 50 degrees below zero. Within 60 days, they had constructed a 10,000-foot runway capable of handling B-52 bombers. By 1953, Thule was operational. At its peak, it housed 10,000 personnel. It had its own power plant, its own hospital, its own communications tower that was, at the time of completion, the third tallest structure on Earth. But Thule was only the beginning. What came next was so classified that the Danish government was not informed. What came next was so ambitious that even today, most Americans do not know it existed. In 1959, the Army Corps of Engineers began constructing Camp Century 150 miles inland from Thule, beneath the ice cap. The official story was scientific research, polar survival training, ice core analysis. The truth was Project Iceworm, a plan to deploy 600 nuclear missiles in a 4,000-kilometer network of tunnels carved into the Greenland ice sheet. The missiles would be mobile, mounted on tracks, constantly moving beneath the glacier to avoid Soviet targeting. If the Soviets launched a first strike, these missiles would survive, and they would retaliate. The engineers at Camp Century believed they had solved the fundamental problem of Arctic military infrastructure. The ice was stable. It did not shift. It did not crack. It would protect the missiles indefinitely. Except the ice was not stable. By 1964, the tunnels were deforming faster than anticipated. The weight of the ice above was crushing the infrastructure below. The snow was not static. It was flowing, compressing, collapsing inward. Project Iceworm was terminated. Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. The nuclear reactor was removed. Everything else was left in place. The waste, the fuel, the chemicals, the sewage. All of it entombed beneath what the engineers calculated would be an ever-thickening layer of ice and snow. The assumption was perpetual accumulation. The assumption was wrong. By 2016, glaciologists at York University and the Geological Survey of Denmark published findings that upended 70 years of Arctic strategy. Climate models demonstrated that by 2090, possibly sooner, the ice sheet covering Camp Century would transition from net accumulation to net melt. Once that tipping point was reached, the buried waste would be exposed within a century. Meltwater would percolate through the firn, picking up PCBs, diesel fuel, radioactive particles, and carrying them down slope toward the coast. 250 kilometers away, the contaminants would reach the ocean. The timeline was no longer theoretical. It was geological inevitability. The political implications were immediate. Greenland's government, which had gained self-rule from Denmark in 1979, demanded answers. Who was responsible for cleaning up a toxic military base on Greenlandic soil? Denmark, which had granted permission for Thule, but was never informed about Camp Century. The United States, which built it and abandoned it. International law was clear about preventing future hazardous waste, but ambiguous about liability for waste already discarded. Denmark initiated the Camp Century Climate Monitoring Program. Scientists began tracking meltwater depth, measuring ice temperatures, using ground-penetrating radar to map the debris field. The monitoring continues today. The contamination timeline has not changed, but Camp Century is not the only liability climate change is exposing in Greenland. Pituffik Space Base itself, the installation that replaced Thule Air Base in 2023, is experiencing structural failure. Permafrost beneath the runways is melting. As the frozen soil thaws, the ground settles unevenly. Cracks appear in concrete. Buildings tilt as foundations sink into softening earth. Radar installations that have scanned the Arctic skies since the Cold War are tilting off their mounts. The base remains operational, but the engineers know what is coming. The infrastructure built to last a century is failing in decades. And there is no easy solution. You cannot refreeze permafrost. You cannot stop the warming Arctic. You can only rebuild, constantly, expensively, on ground that is becoming less stable every year. This is the paradox that makes Greenland the most dangerous real estate bet on Earth. The strategic value is increasing at the exact moment the physical stability is collapsing. As the Arctic warms, new realities emerge. Shipping lanes that were impassable for 11 months of the year are now navigable for 6. The Northern Sea Route, which cuts transit time from Asia to Europe by 40% compared to the Suez Canal, is opening. Russia has militarized its Arctic coastline with new bases, new icebreakers, new missile systems. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and announced plans for a polar Silk Road linking Asia to Europe through Arctic waters. And Greenland sits at the center of it all. Control Greenland, and you control access to the North Atlantic. You monitor all naval traffic through the Geopolitical Gap, the narrow ocean corridors between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom that Soviet submarines had to transit to reach open water. You control the surveillance of the Arctic approaches to North America. You position yourself at the intersection of 3 spheres of influence: American, European, Russian, and beneath the ice, locked in rock formations that have not seen sunlight in millennia, lie the rare earth minerals that power the modern world. Neodymium for electric motors, dysprosium for wind turbines, lithium for batteries, tantalum for smartphones. Greenland's southern deposits contain an estimated 1.5 million metric tons of proven rare earth reserves, possibly as much as 42 million metric tons when unproven resources are included. If the higher estimate is accurate, Greenland ranks second globally, behind only China. China currently controls 90% of global rare earth processing. Beijing has used this monopoly as geopolitical leverage, restricting exports to countries that displease it. The United States, Europe, and their allies have spent 2 decades trying to break this dependency. Greenland represents the largest accessible alternative source outside Chinese control, but extracting these minerals is not simple. Greenland has no roads connecting its settlements. It has minimal port infrastructure. It produces insufficient energy for industrial-scale mining. The ore grades are low, often 1% rare earth content compared to 5 to 10% in established mines elsewhere. This means 10 times the rock must be moved for the same output. The climate is prohibitively harsh. Construction seasons last weeks, not months. And even if mining were feasible, the minerals would still need to be shipped to China for processing, because China controls the refineries, the separation facilities, the entire supply chain downstream of extraction. This is why Trump's repeated attempts to purchase or control Greenland are not mere geopolitical theater. They are recognition of a calculation that every major power has made. Greenland is indispensable, not despite the dangers, because of them. The melting ice exposes both the toxic legacy of Cold War military operations and the mineral wealth required for 21st century technology. The crumbling permafrost threatens existing bases, while new shipping routes create demand for expanded surveillance. The geopolitical value increases as the physical infrastructure collapses. This is the bet. Whoever controls Greenland controls the Arctic. Whoever controls the Arctic shapes the balance of power for the next century. In January 2026, President Trump told reporters at the White House that the United States would take action on Greenland, whether they like it or not. He claimed that if America did not control Greenland, Russia or China would. He suggested both economic pressure and military force were options under consideration. Vice President Vance visited Pituffik Space Base and stated that Denmark had failed to adequately secure Greenland, that America was prepared to go as far as necessary to defend its Arctic interests. White House officials confirmed they were actively discussing options to acquire the territory. The reaction from Europe was immediate and unequivocal. Denmark's Prime Minister warned that any American military action against a NATO ally would mean the end of everything, including NATO. Greenland's 5 major political parties issued a joint statement demanding that the United States' contempt for our country ends. They declared that 85% of Greenlanders oppose American control, that Greenland's future must be decided by Greenlanders, that their territory is not for sale. European leaders published letters affirming that Greenland's sovereignty was inviolable, that the territorial integrity of NATO members was non-negotiable. But the voices that matter most are not in Washington, or Copenhagen, or Brussels. They are in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, where 57,000 people live in a territory larger than Mexico with no standing military, no capacity for self-defense, and no mechanism to prevent great powers from imposing their will. Greenland has been working toward full independence from Denmark for decades. The goal is statehood, sovereignty, self-determination. But statehood requires financial independence. Greenland currently receives $600 million annually in subsidies from Denmark. Mining revenues could theoretically replace that income, except the mining industry does not exist. Only one mine operates on the entire island, extracting anorthosite for insulation. Rare earth extraction remains years away, possibly decades, requiring hundreds of billions in infrastructure investment that Greenland cannot afford. This is the trap. Greenland needs economic independence to achieve political independence. Economic independence requires resource extraction. Resource extraction requires foreign investment. Foreign investment comes with strings attached. China offered financing. The United States blocked it on national security grounds. American companies offered financing. Greenland's parliament banned uranium mining, effectively killing the Kvanefjeld rare earth project that had received $200 million in development funding. Every path to independence runs through a great power veto. Every attempt at self-determination requires permission from someone else. And while the political chess match plays out, the ice continues melting. The cracks in Patufik's runways widen. The snow covering Camp Century thins. The permafrost beneath Greenland's coastal settlements destabilizes. In 2017, a mountainside in northwestern Greenland collapsed 3,000 feet into a fjord. The resulting tsunami washed over 2 villages, killing 4 people. Geologists warned that as the ice sheet retreats, nothing buttresses the near-vertical valley walls. The rock is unsupported. Entire slopes are unstable. More collapses are inevitable. Greenland's infrastructure, built to withstand cold, cannot withstand the warming that is coming. Bridges designed for snowmelt are being swept away by glacial floods. Harbors are becoming too shallow as the land rebounds from the weight of melting ice. The island is rising 6 feet per century. Ship traffic will soon be impossible at current docks. This is what makes Greenland the most dangerous real estate bet on Earth. Not just that it is contested, not just that superpowers want it, but that the very forces making it valuable are destroying the foundations on which that value rests. The warming that opens shipping lanes is cracking the runways of the bases that monitor those lanes. The melting that exposes mineral deposits is releasing the toxic waste from the last era of resource extraction. The climate change that increases strategic importance is collapsing the ground beneath strategic installations. Every gain comes with a liability. Every opportunity arrives wrapped in consequence. Every bet on Greenland's future requires accepting that the past is leaking through the ice. There is no resolution to this story because the story is still unfolding. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is scheduled to meet with the foreign ministers of Denmark and Greenland next week. What he will propose, no one outside the administration knows. Whether Denmark can resist American pressure, no one can predict. Whether Greenland can maintain its opposition when economic incentives are offered, no one can guarantee. Whether NATO survives an American move against a member state, no one wants to discover. The meetings will happen. The negotiations will begin. The Arctic will continue warming. The ice will continue retreating. Camp Century's toxins will continue their inexorable migration toward the coast. And in 100 years, when historians look back at this moment, they will recognize it for what it is. The point where great powers realized that the next century's dominance would be determined not by who controlled the Middle East or the South China Sea or Eastern Europe, but by who controlled a frozen island most people had never heard of. The point where climate change stopped being an environmental issue and became a geopolitical weapon, reshaping borders and alliances and spheres of influence. The point where nations that built their security on permanence, on glaciers and permafrost and frozen ground, discovered that nothing about the Arctic was permanent anymore. The engineers who built Thule Air Base in 1951 believed they were constructing infrastructure for the ages. The soldiers who staffed Camp Century in 1960 believed the ice would preserve their work forever. The diplomats who signed the 1951 defense agreement believed Greenland's strategic value would remain constant. They were all wrong. The ground is shifting, literally, geologically, politically. And the bets placed 70 years ago are coming due. Not in some distant future. Not after we are gone. Right now. In cracking runways and melting ice caps and political ultimatums issued from the White House, the most dangerous real estate bet on Earth is not a prediction. It is happening. And no one, not the Americans who want it, not the Danes who claim it, not the Greenlanders who live on it, not the Chinese and Russians who covet it, can stop what has already been set in motion. The ice does not negotiate. The permafrost does not compromise. The Earth moves according to laws that do not recognize sovereignty, or treaties, or national security doctrines. And Greenland, caught between melting and militarization, between independence and coercion, between its past, buried in ice, and its future, written by powers that do not care what 57,000 Inuit want, is about to discover what every small nation eventually learns. When you sit on top of what the great powers need, your land becomes their battlefield, your sovereignty becomes their debate, your future becomes their decision. The runways are cracking, Camp Century is thawing, the bet has been made, and there is no walking away from the table now.